are you there?
Yes. Thank you for joining us today. We'd like to welcome you to this webinar.
And I'll take over for a moment while you deal with that. Yeah, it's lots of things happening in addition to cold weather in Atlanta, Georgia today. Phones are ringing and things are occurring. And we were on the phone earlier today with Rochester as we were doing a program there. And Atlanta was only 1 degree warmer than Rochester. And I think this dip in cold weather has affected all of us as we come together. This is part of the Crisis Coach webinar series that we are doing with the Tennessee Association of Independent Schools, and we're excited that you're joining us today.
Good. We invite you to become our friend on Facebook, Firestorm Solutions, and you can follow us on Twitter at Firestorm Soul. And yes, there is a hashtag for that session, and the hashtag is Crisis Coach. Firestorm transforms crisis into value and empowers you to manage risk and crises. Firestorm expertise is crisis communication, crisis management, critical decision support, crisis public relations, and consequence management. Please keep in mind that this discussion is not complete without the accompanying oral comments, and the work product presented must be read in conjunction with your organization's personal counsel. And the information given, comments made, should not be interpreted as legal advice or legal opinion. We're pleased to have the Tennessee Association of Independent Schools as the underwriter and sponsor of this Crisis Coach webinar series. Today, we're going to be talking about building an intelligence network at your school. Our presenter is the president of Firestorm, Jim Satterfield.
And Bill, I'm going to jump in, and we need to send a link to Rich Martin because Rich is trying to join us, and he doesn't seem to have it at this moment. If you can do that, and I'll take over, and hopefully he'll join us shortly.
Okay.
As we've been working with the Tennessee Association last year, and as we continue forward, Rich is, of course, the executive director, and he's having a little connection problem in coming on, and he'll join us in a few minutes. We're excited about the idea of working together, and there's coming up this spring a Crisis Coach workshop, and will be available to all the schools in Tennessee that you can participate and go through making decisions in a crisis. What we're focused on this quarter is a 3-part webinar series around building an intelligence network in your school. And we're going to go into some details around that today and start to build the first area focused on particular areas of behavior, areas that we should be aware of that would be happening within your school that you need to intervene and take steps and particularly to address. We'll recognize Rich as soon as he comes on board, and so Bill, when you see that he's there, let me know and I'll stop and we'll go back and pick Rich up and have him join us in our discussions today. And as you think about that, the Tennessee Association has been actively supporting independent schools for over 40 years. I think we're in the 41st year now, so they'll have to update that seal on the slides. And we've been fortunate enough to attend multiple meetings and working with the schools, and Gertie Knox, who is the Firestorm principal, who is focused on helping the schools in the state of Tennessee specifically as we've merged forward and carrying forward. My name is Jim Satterfield. I'm president and founder of Firestorm, and I've been privileged to be able to be with you on the majority of these webinars each and every month. There's a lot of issues to think about within our schools, and that's do you have the ability to identify what your next crisis is? And that theme we're going to focus on a lot more today as we come into the aspect of risk in areas. Do you see an advantage if you knew that a particular exposure was present in your school to be able to intervene at that point in time before it had, in fact, had occurred to de-escalate it? Knowing where your organization's next crisis, where your school's next crisis comes from, should be the challenge that faces each of us every day. As we follow the Firestorm process, predict, plan, perform, those are the tools that we use as we develop these individual plans. The predict is understanding what the vulnerabilities and threats are, what are their impacts, how do we monitor, and we're going to talk a lot about monitoring today, and then particularly what the triggers are. Before I move on, Bill, do you know if Rich has been able to join us?
Rich should be on right now.
Are you, Rich?
I am. Can you hear me?
We can. Welcome. Happy
Thank
New
you.
Year. Did you get a little cold up there in Tennessee last night?
Yeah, and it's still cold.
Well, we were on with Rochester. I shared with the folks today on the call earlier. In Atlanta, it was only 1 degree warmer than Rochester. So that's really kind of scary when you throw terms out like that. Sorry that we messed you up this morning, but glad to have you on. And we shared, if you're on the slide decks, talking about the Tennessee Association and what's been going on. Do you want to give some updates about what's about to be happening in Tennessee?
Well, I can say we do have a lot of new, several new programs, workshops that are coming out this spring that haven't been put on our website. So do look at our website, and we will be revising and adding to that for the next week or two as we finalize a couple of new events. And at the end, I might say something about some events, workshops that are of particular interest to administrators that we'll do. So for now, welcome to this important webinar, and we want to learn more about how to know what we don't know. So Jim and Bill, help us.
Well, thanks, and I'm glad to have you again with us today. It's always a pleasure. I think as we start in, the world we're in is certainly subject to change, and the pressures that we see occurring there, the events yesterday in Paris, the shootings that occurred there, certainly keep top of mind the concept of violence and terrorism and what the concerns are that we face each and every day. Our goal is ultimately to identify those behaviors before they rise to that level. Now, the threats have been made, and as we think back to after 9/11, Al-Qaeda making specific threats against our schools across the country, the idea of the lone wolf or the small force coming in makes a specific threat that we should be concerned about. The shootings in Paris, by the way, if you followed that in the news, when they entered the building, then they hit the floor, they waylaid a lady with a child to type in the access code so they could go into the room to begin the shooting. Imagine the impact upon that child. Imagine the impact upon that mother of seeing and hearing those events occur. That's part of the reason that we live in a world where violence, unfortunately, is all too common, whether it's in a business or in a public school or in an independent school. Those are issues that face us. We also are seeing continued communicable illness threats. We're in the middle of flu season, and we're seeing that the majority of the states now are at high elevated levels. If I were to tell you today that 28 children died of Ebola in the United States, you'd go, whoa, wait a minute, that's unbelievable. 28 children have died of the flu in the United States this year. 28. This is a serious aspect, and monitoring it and having plans in place and tracking it make a difference in your school. Additionally, some 8 states have had measles outbreaks that have occurred. The most obvious story is the one that occurred from Disneyland and coming together. We're seeing childhood disease being a factor in our schools and looking at it. So the rates of change is a key element for us to think about as we go forward. So who's responsible? Well, leadership is. In the case of our independent schools, it's our board, it's our headmaster, it's the leadership within our school that has the responsibility for preparing for these risks. Unfortunately, across schools and businesses in America, we see that people are not focused on identifying these risks prior to them occurring. Now, that's an important element for us to consider. We need to be able to identify the risk before they occur and become a crisis. That should be the challenge that faces all of us each and every day. If we don't eliminate them, they'll have a tremendous impact upon our people, our brand, or our reputation. Think about how you'll be known as the school where this occurred, and that will become the defining element associated with who you are in each of those areas. So as we think back to the slide that we showed earlier, can we really predict a crisis? And the answer is yes. Many times there have been reports that there were warning signs that went unheeded, signs that people didn't fully recognize at that point in time and only became clear after the fact. And so today we're going to be talking about indicators. What are the indicators that are in that process that we should be thinking about before it reaches a crisis and coming together? So the value is in identifying these indicators, and we can then avoid the crisis before it even occurs. Instead of being focused on the fire drill, what do we do when the fire starts, or the standard protocol, lock down, lock out, shelter in place, evacuate, those are all actions to take place after an event has been occurring. What we want to be able to do is to change that focus much earlier in the process. And these indicators can be shaped by severity and frequency. And we've seen that these patterns repeat over and over again. And that's really what we want to share with you. So as we think about indicators, they're clue cues, and that's somewhat of a tongue twister for me to say today, so I had to slow down, that give us information about emerging events. They're things that are occurring right now in your school, and wouldn't you want to know about it if you knew it? They could be behavioral, they could be transactional, they could be processed, and they could be transmitted verbally, people talking about it, or nonverbal means, which include things like postings on social media. Those elements are there. So whether we're turning to the left or the right, we need to understand what the crisis indicators are so that we can become responsive in these areas. Now, the first step in any of this is having an awareness program in your school so that everyone must understand what the warning signs are. What are the warning signs of behaviors of concern? And in particular, I don't want to miss the threats and statements of intent to cause harm. Those are even more of an alert, because if a threat is done, even if it's a veiled threat, I might do this, or conditional, hey, if this doesn't happen, this is the action I'm going to take, or direct, and those are the ones we're most concerned about. I'm going to do this thing on this tie to this person. Those cannot be ignored. They have to be carried out. But having this awareness level, that's one of the key aspects if we're really going to build an intelligence network. And everybody then must be trained on what these indicators are, both behavioral and environmental, that suggest that an individual is on this pathway, and that we then want to be able to intervene before that escalates up to an action that's taken. So as we look at this, to create, how do we know what we don't know? We've got to create an intelligence network. In your school, do you have an intelligence network? And we'll talk about the components that go into that in just a few minutes. But our goal is to know today what's going to happen tomorrow. If you knew today there was going to be a problem in your school, would you take action? Absolutely. It's much better to do this before the events have escalated, and following the predict, plan, perform process will certainly be a long way to helping you get there. We want to transform uncertainty into certainty, because we're not quite clear. Let's make this much more specific. Is this a behavior of concern that we want to have actions taken, or is it minor? And so bringing that certainty, having clearly established metrics to do the evaluation, those are what we're going to be focused on. The what, the where, the when, the pattern of life that's going on around that. And in order to do that, we're going to be talking about listening and looking. In order to know what's going on, you have to listen and you have to look. And we'll start to build more detailed around those in coming webinars, but at least to give you a little bit of an idea when we're talking about, we want to be able to create some conversion aggregators, some conversation aggregators, identifying what's being communicated within our school and among our people. We utilize streams. Those streams are made up of phrases, and the phrases are made up of words. It gives us a general situational awareness about what's in fact going on within our organization. Once we find something in that area, then we start to look more specifically at it. We look at a person of interest. It could be a specific location, event, based upon an identified crisis threat, risk or exposure or vulnerability. We even have the ability to do geocoding. We can put up a geofence around the school to talk about what's going on within that particular aspect, or a geofence around an event, or a geofence around a home to be able to come together. If we've identified a person of interest, we then look at their sphere of influence. Who are they talking with? Who are they sharing that information? And it becomes a much more targeted approach to be able to create this work as it comes together. So listening and looking are going to be the themes that you hear us repeat over and over again as we're starting to create the idea of having an intelligence network. And when we think about intelligence and information, what we're trying to do is to make it predictive of what's going to happen next. And as always, communication is the most perishable forms of intelligence. They are going to suffer over time. What was said a year ago is not going to have a merit as much as what's being said today and carrying together. And it combines both hard and soft data. Soft data would indicate human behavior, in your intuition, your experiences that will give us some soft data points to reference. And don't underestimate your experience with your students and what you know about your school. Hard data includes emails, social media postings, and any specific statements of intent. Those are looking at, and those become hard data points for us in predictive intelligence. Their technology can clearly aid in hard intelligence in hard data. Now that's much more than a Google search on the internet. There are tools that create this listening net for us, as well as tools that allow us to go and look at a particular teacher or a particular student, and then to look at the sphere of contact and influence there for the monitoring. If you don't have tools that you're currently using in your schools, you're finding that there's information that doesn't flow to you, and you're trying to take the test without having done the homework. You need to be able to understand all of the components that are here to come together. And the last is there needs to be a central repository, because this fact over here might be added to that fact over there, and the combination then provides you actionable intelligence, provides you some ability to come together, because information tends to get siloed. It gets siloed in schools and in businesses where there are behaviors of concern that aren't effectively communicated so that intervention can come together. Now, when we look at creating an intelligence network, there are 4 components. Background checks, and we've talked about those previously, and we certainly can go into more detail on that later in the year. Anonymous reporting, and generally anonymous reporting has failed in most organizations. The see something, say something, while it's catchy and easy to remember, we find that people are seeing things and they're not saying things. Regularly, as we're doing the monitoring, we'll go through and find that there were 20, 30, or 40 people that were aware of something, and not one of them had come forward. Creating a climate where it's safe to do anonymous reporting is important. Today, we're going to focus on behavioral risk threat assessment. That's the reason why it's bolded, to share that information with you. What do you do if you've had this come up? How do you assess, is this a threat or is it not? That's where we're going to come in and look a little bit deeper today. And then finally, the social media monitoring, the listening to see the general phrases and terms that are out there, the looking at particular individuals to be able to monitor that, to see are the threats real and carrying forward. It is also used as part of the behavioral risk assessment. That's another data gathering tool that you have that ability to go back in time and see what has this person been saying and posting, even if they've deleted it. It gives us that capability. So a crisis is a risk event which one has not identified the vulnerabilities and exposures, hasn't developed a plan, and therefore doesn't know how to proceed. Our goal with the Crisis Coach webinar series has been to continually try to help you deal with it before it's a crisis. Because once it's a crisis, that puts you in a position that will have the most impact upon you, your school, and your students. So as we think about this, and we think about behavioral risk assessment, what do you do and when do you do it? Our goal here is over on the right. We want to intervene down at behaviors of concern before it escalates to threatening, before it escalates to physical injury, before there's death involved. Now, if we take a look at everything spread out from a risk standpoint, those things that are low, you're not having a problem with that. Your normal discipline is occurring. You know when someone does something inappropriate, something occurs within your school, and it's minor, you're going to handle it in your normal distribution, and you're doing a great job in those areas. Similarly, if it's at the other extreme, if it's a high-risk area, if someone has brought a gun to school, there's been an attack that's occurred, then you know what, you're going to pick up the phone, call 911, and deal with the violence. The two extremes here, the very low and the very high, those are easy, and we're doing a great job in all our schools in Tennessee in dealing with that. But it's this middle area where it's gray. There's a behavior of concern out here. What is it that I do? Should we do something? Should we not do something? And how does and what are the actions that we would take, and how do we know where we are? We further divide those behaviors of concern into three buckets: guarded, elevated, and severe. We take different actions depending upon which level it would be. Guarded, it's not so much, it's just a little bit more than low. Severe, it's almost up to the point we have to call the police. Clearly differentiators in that middle area of elevated. We'll go into that in more depth in a few minutes, but what do you do with these behaviors of concern? That's our focus today, today's webinar, as we're talking about it. So a behavioral risk threat assessment is to assist in identifying, assessing, managing, and monitoring these behaviors of concern. It's that middle ground area where it's certainly more than just normal everyday stuff, and it's not all the way to being a violent act that you have to intervene with the police. And there has to be a framework here and established goals and procedures and training that come forward within your organization. That's what we're focused on talking about today as it comes together. Now, there are four elements associated with this, and one is awareness, that people need to understand and be trained on what are behaviors of concern, and that's your students, it's your teachers, it's your faculty, it's your staff, it's your administrators, it's everyone that's involved. Reporting, then they have to know how to come forward, and it's not only employees, it's your students too. There has to be this central repository, how we monitor and maintain this information so it doesn't get lost, and carrying it forward. And then if there's a behavior of concern, it's in this gray area, you've got to have a plan. Well, how are you going to deal with it? What are you going to do from an investigation? How are you going to screen this particular one to evaluate, is there an area of concern associated with it? Develop an action plan of what are we going to do with this person who has a problem? How are we going to monitor it, sign off, and record keeping? Those are going to be the elements that we're going to be associated with having a behavioral risk threat assessment program within our schools. Now that acronym BERTHA that you see down there under plan, that's taking the BE out of behavioral, the R out of risk, the TH out of threat, and the A out of assessment. So that acronym is what stands for BERTHA. It gives us a little bit of a shortcut to be able to talk about these individual issues. But let's go into this in a little bit more and talking about those elements that are required within the plan. We have to have an investigation methodology. We have to have documented procedures and forms so that we make sure we're doing the same thing the same way every time. By the way, this is a key vulnerability for the school, because if you're seen as treating one student one way and another student a different way, or that you didn't follow all the details and ultimately this escalates into violence, then you're going to find yourself explaining. And in a crisis, if you're explaining, you're losing. So having a detailed system, and you can start today, document what you currently do, have a standard form that's filled out, have it tracked, have it maintained. Make sure that you have identified who's going to be doing the investigation and that they're trained in order to conduct that. That's going to be an important element later, particularly if there's an adverse outcome that comes from this. In many cases, you might want to coordinate with your legal counsel. There could be some privilege capabilities that could be utilized associated with it. then you want to have a behavioral assessment team, and that would be at least 3 individuals within your school, no more than 5, that would be looking at a student who has exhibited this behavior of concern, because you're going to ultimately have to render an opinion of, is this child or teacher a risk to themselves or others. Someone from your counseling department would be good. If you have a separate HR function, that would be good if you've got a security function. Or you could take someone else from the administration to be involved in it. Do not make the team less than 3, nor more than 5. Then you have to determine what screening tools you're using. Are you going to follow the Secret Service protocols or the FBI? There are Waiver 21, Mosaic, Kwood. A lot of the screening tools are excellent. All have strengths, all have weaknesses, but using the same tool, the same way, every time by people who've been trained becomes extremely critical to the school. You've got to determine when you're going to notify the threat assessment team and how they're going to convene the moment a behavior of concern has been identified. At the conclusion of the investigation and screening, then you need to implement a corrective action plan. What are we going to do with this person to make sure that this doesn't happen again as we go forward with it, looking at it? Now, the elements then of the plan are, we've already given them to you on an earlier slide, but a little bit more description here for you to look at. The investigation, the behavior risk screening, the action plan, the monitoring plan, the sign-off and record keeping. Now, that area that's in that gray medium risk concern, not the minor, not the low, not the major where we're calling 911, that's where we're really going to be doing the risk screening, and that's where your methodology and consistency makes a difference. If you're uncertain on a particular individual, then we need to bring in a third party, someone that's a forensic psychologist, for example, who has been trained and clinically able to diagnose, is this person a risk to themselves or others. So as we focus on the behavioral screening and dividing that medium bracket into guarded, elevated, and severe, now you understand where the training elements start to come into place. The action plan is, what are we going to do now that we've screened this person? What are the steps that we're going to take? How are we going to monitor them? And then maintaining adequate records and keeping on this. This confidential central repository becomes a key element to differentiate it. Now, the monitoring in this area is an area where social media can be a great tool. Looking at that particular individual, their sphere of influence, having the time machine, being able to go back and look at those episodes, that will give you the ability to discern when, in fact, you should take more specific action. So hopefully now it's starting to make a little bit more sense about how you can know what you don't know. And the first element is the listening and the looking and coming together. But let's go into a little bit more depth in this behavioral risk screening, because that's the most difficult skill of all. Now, we divide that in that medium category into 3 distinct levels. And we use the green, yellow, red as an indicator of green, it's not too high, you can go. Yellow, maybe we better take a little, it's that caution warning light. And severe, you really come to a stop. So if you've gone through the screening, whatever protocol or tool that you use by those 3 members of your behavioral assessment team, that might say, well, hey, it's at a guarded level. There's something here, but it's not much more than what we would normally see. We're going to do some supervision. We're going to have some intervention. We'll talk with the person about it. We're going to be monitoring it. And then we are going to have a specific follow-up point that we come back to with this particular one. Even if this behavior de-escalates, we're going to keep that in the central repository so that if some other behaviors come up, we have this as a reference point. That becomes extremely important as you're moving into the predict aspect of what's occurring. If, as you've gone through your assessment, you think, well, it's not low, it's elevated, it's that next level up, we have to do more enhanced supervision. We're going to be much closer to this person who has the problem. And we're going to then have specific things that we're going to do in the intervention with them, and much more enhanced over that very low level that's there, that we're going to have a specific date certain for follow-up, and we're going to carry it together. Now, you'll notice both on the guarded and on the elevated, we're doing follow-up at specific times associated with it. One of the patterns that we've seen, both from a frequency and a severity, is the lack of follow-up becomes a trigger for other problems that will occur down the road. And that becomes an element that we want you to be focused on in each of these areas. Now the severe level. Your behavioral assessment team has gone through, you've done your screening, and we're saying, hey, this is really severe. We need to carry this forward. At that point in time, once you hit that category, now we're still in that medium. We haven't come up to the gun and the attack in the school or whatever's occurred. We then need to remove that person from the workplace. We need to remove them from school. If they're a student, we send them home. If they're a teacher or someone else, we pull them out of the classroom until we're confident on this process. Now, we want some third party to judge that they're no longer an imminent threat to themselves or others. And that's an important element to carry forward. So we'd be looking for a referral to a psychologist or a psychiatrist or a forensic psychologist who then can certainly intervene and do a much more formal assessment than the behavioral assessment team associated with that. At this point in time, there has to be a written action and monitoring plan to take into account any reentry requirements. Because if the behavior of concern has de-escalated sufficiently that a professional says, no, they're okay to come back, they can come back to school, well then what's the actions that we're going to take? How are we going to be monitoring this person? And what specific requirements are we going to have to make sure that we are there when they return to school? So this is a major step forward as you think about behaviors of concern. Minor, handle it just as you do today. Major, where the event and the threat's occurring, you're calling 911. But in this middle area, whether it's guarded, elevated, or severe, there are different actions that you would take and different controls and monitoring that you would put in place around it. That's why the training of your behavioral assessment team becomes so absolutely critical. And the consistency of the screening that occurs is one that we want you to be clearly established with to understand. We've seen this repeated over and over. We've seen it occurring in public schools. We've seen it occurring in independent schools. We've seen it occurring in businesses. These patterns repeat, and that's why it's important that you have a uniform way to determine the risk level that's associated with it. I would encourage you to think about these three categories as we go forward. So what are some of the triggers? What is it that we should be recognizing that would tend to give us these behaviors of concern? Clearly threats. Whether the threat is bail, I might do this, or conditional, if this doesn't happen, this is what I'm going to do, or direct. I'm going to take this action on this date to this individual, and that's clearly that severe high level that we're focused on in carrying forward. We're seeing those threats become key indicators. By the way, most of the school shooters, the vast majority, well over 2/3, were bullied. Well over 2/3 had never been a problem before. So many times we think about the bully, but it's the person who is the victim that we're seeing in many cases can trigger this back. So understanding that becomes a key element. Another area is the verbal behavior. What are they saying? What's the language? What is the tone that's being said? These could well be triggers or indicators to us, or cues and clues associated with it. So listening what's being said verbally. Written behavior, and it brings us back to that intelligence network, the monitoring of social media. It's much more than just a Google search. There are unique tools that help you go through that area, because if they're posting pictures, if they're making comments and threats there, if that's being documented and posted and shared with others within your school, it is assumed by the parents that you know what's going on within your school. It's out there. It's in the public domain. You just have to listen and look, and you'll see it. Physical. If something has come to the point of an attack, a blow, a strike, those types of things clearly are immediate triggers of the behaviors of concern, and you would go through the screening process and the investigation that we've talked about. Sexual abuse and sexual molestation. Unfortunately, this too is in our schools, and this is an area that we see increasingly concerns associated with that. Domestic violence. Domestic violence comes into the school on a regular basis. We're dealing with a webinar that we did earlier this morning out of Rochester, New York, and we're talking about a story where a teacher who had gone on vacation was killed as part of a murder-suicide aspect. Your staff, the people know where they're going to be at a point in time. They know the teacher was going to be entering school at this time, leaving at school at that time. Domestic violence is coming in to the school workplace because it's an identified point. And it also comes in through our students, and that they're involved in those families and are victims of those same areas that are there. And then finally, suicide, and whether looking at the suicide scale and indicators of those areas, but we're seeing a direct link between suicide and violence, not only to the person who's threatening suicide themselves, but to the actions that they would take. The shootings that occurred late last year in Seattle, the student identified the people that they wanted to attack, invited them to the cafeteria at a certain time and a certain table, and then came in, and everyone that he had a vengeance against was in one place at one time, and he could take them out and then commit suicide. Suicide is a significant concern, and there's an expectation, and unfortunately, we see repeated over and over again, there were signs that were missed. There were cues, there were indicators, and no one recognized it, and no one came forward to report it, and therefore the only action that could be taken was the actual suicide that occurred. So we've talked a lot about the investigation, and we've talked about the monitoring, and we've talked about the screening and dividing it into guarded, elevated, and severe. But what do we do then with the plans that we've now identified this person that we need to put some things in place? First of all, your action plan on an individual basis must be regularly reviewed. Once someone has hit this area, we want to keep them there, not only this week or next week, but on until we view that they're no longer pose a danger to themselves or others. It's not just write a plan and put it in a folder. It's the monitoring, it's the intervention, it's the discussion. That becomes absolutely critical. And we have to share that with anyone who comes in contact with that person. What other teachers, what other coaches are involved? Who else on your staff? We obviously want to treat the information as confidential, but we need to have a direct involvement with them to make sure that everything is dealt with and coming along. Now, in dealing with all of this, in order to make it actionable, you must have it detailed. You must start to write your plans now and having them spelled out. I pulled a table out of one of the plans that we had done for an organization, and you can see here the level of detail, and we find that checklists work quite well. That way you can say, yeah, we did this here, no, we haven't done it, this doesn't apply. And you can also see that it's assigned to a particular function or a person associated with it. You get the report of the incident or the behavior of concern. Life and safety first. If we think there's a risk, we're not screening something where we're calling 911. We're getting the police involved. We'll deal with it after the fact, but we're going to carry it forward. But depending upon the urgency, then we want to ensure that we're supervising this person. We want to make sure where they are and carry that through. Then we want to fill out an incident report. And you want to have standard forms and procedures. We have seen schools become greatly liable because they didn't follow the same procedure the same way every time through that process. But forget about being liable. We don't want to see a child or an employee fall through the cracks here. We want to make sure that everybody comes together and that we've gone through it. Then we gather the information and forms for interviews and how you track the information. The interview that you'd have with, let's assume that this person is a student, with them, with their parents, with their other teachers, that you're collaborating and collecting documentation. And then you can start to develop what the appropriate plan and treatment and protocol would be and what the re-entry requirements are. And having everyone understand this up front becomes very critical. So why I showed you this page was to let you know that there are great details that need to be in place. Details really matter. You really need to understand what's going on and coming in place. So if I were to come back and ask you what the next steps were, I would ask you, do you really want to know what's going to happen tomorrow? If you answer no on that, I then would ask you, could you afford not to know? Because the information about what's going to happen tomorrow in your school is available to you today if you had an intelligence network. If you'd like to know more, you can contact Firestorm to learn how to align your plans to best practices. We can help you create your own intelligence network that you can manage and have real-time alerts coming in to let you know when there's a behavior of concern. Or we can schedule crisis coach training to talk about how do you go about screening students. How do you go through this process? How is this maintained and how does it come into place? If you'd like to know where your plans are relative to standards and best practices, because of the relationship with the Tennessee Association of Independent Schools, we can do that assessment for you and waive the cost. It's a $2,500 value that you can learn about your preparedness plans or safety or security or your behavioral risk threat assessment program within your school. Our thanks go out to the Tennessee Association of Independent Schools for sponsoring this webinar series. And I want to go back to you, Rich, and do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I do. Thanks, Jim, for the information. This is important information, and everyone can benefit by thinking through these things. You either have a plan in place, or it's time to review what you have, or you don't have as good a plan as you thought you did, or maybe you've never really thought all of this through. But we do have 2 more sessions in this series, and I think it'd be good to pay attention to those and tune in on the next 2 weeks. The other thing I want to say is, for administrators, we have a number of sessions specifically geared toward administrators, and I'll mention a couple of them. And you can learn more on our website about this. For those who are division heads, Rethinking Teacher Supervision and Evaluation with Kim Marshall is going to be happening at Harding Academy on the 28th of January. And in February, there's a Heads and Trustees workshop with Steve Robinson, the outgoing president of SAIS. We'll have some really good information for heads and trustees, so take advantage of that. It'll be at Harding Academy. And I think I made a mistake about Rethinking Teacher Evaluation and Supervision. That'll be at CPA, Christ Presbyterian Academy. And also in February, Strategic Planning for Independent Schools with Stuart McCarthy, head of Lausanne Collegiate School, and the assistant head, Michael Christopher, both of whom have done some outstanding work with strategic planning. We have others as well, but those are the ones coming up quickly, and we hope to see some of you with those as well. Jim, over to you.
Thanks, and thanks for all that the Tennessee Association of Independent Schools does for our schools and our young people. It makes a difference. If you would like to listen to this recording or share it with others within your organization, you can go to firestorm.com/TAIS and link back to this recording or any of the earlier ones. You can send us an email at webinars@firestorm.com, and we'll answer your questions, or give us a call at 800-321-2219. We live in a time of great change. We live in a time of, unfortunately, increasing risk and exposures. The key element here today that I'd like you to take back is that there are behaviors of concern that are happening today in your school. You need to be able to identify those, assess them, and take appropriate action. Having an intelligence network empowers you to provide that solution now. Until next month, have a great 2015 and a wonderful school year. And if there's some warm air up in Tennessee, if you'd send it down to Georgia, we'd really appreciate it down here. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day. We look forward to speaking with you next month. Goodbye.